Okay, I'm going to talk you through this PowerPoint that I had put online last week because I wanted to make sure that the notes made some sense to you, that I put them in some context. So, what we're talking about the next couple of days is civil rights. And as you can see on the screen, civil rights are rights that protect a person against arbitrary discrimination. Um, so, an example that I use a lot, a law that puts murderers in jail. You go to jail if you commit a murder. That's a discriminatory law. It discriminates, and it discriminates against murderers because it treats murderers differently than people who didn't commit murder. So to discriminate means to treat two people differently or two groups of people differently. So a murder law treats killers differently than it treats non-killers, and that's the kind of discrimination that I think and hope most of us are okay with. That murderers go to jail, the rest of us don't. What civil rights protect against is arbitrary discrimination. And arbitrary in this context means discrimination that doesn't make any sense, that's not for a good reason, that's not based on fact. So what we're going to look at is, with civil rights, two types of discrimination. Discrimination by the government, by law, where the government treats different groups of people differently. So for example, public schools, where the whites go here and the other races go there. Or discrimination by a private person, or more likely a business, where a business treats its customers or its employees differently. For example, a restaurant that said no Hispanics in this restaurant, that would be discrimination by a business. So what we're going to look at is two different types of discrimination, and we're going to start with government discrimination. So just as an example of sort of where things were as far as racial discrimination back in the day. And you all know American history, you know the history of slavery, etc. But just to make that point clear, there was a Supreme Court case in 1857, just to make it clear how far we have come, even though we have a long way to go, that said that black men in America, whether free or slave, had zero rights under the Constitution. None. And also that black men who were slaves were not people, but they were property. And so I put this slide in there just to show where we started as a country as far as racial discrimination. And we're going to see kind of the progression of that over time. So this was in 1857. This was a few years before the Civil War started. It was one of the causes of the Civil War starting. And that case is called Dred Scott and Sanford. The Civil War occurs a few years later, and as a result of that, we add 3 amendments to the Constitution. And you remember how an amendment's added? It's 2/3 of Congress, 3/4 of states. And so the 13th Amendment made clear after the Civil War ended that slavery was abolished. No state could allow slavery, no more slavery anywhere. The 15th, and I'll come back to the 14th, the 15th said that people of any race can vote. So you can't take away somebody's right to vote just because of their race. And then the 14th, which is what we're going to spend a little more time talking about today, says a couple different things. One of them says that anybody born in the U.S. is a citizen. And they said that to basically to overturn the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott, to make it clear that if you were born in America, regardless of the color of your skin, you are in fact a U.S. citizen. And then the second thing that it does, it adds something called the Equal Protection Clause, which said that states have to protect all of their citizens equally. And this applied to all states all over the country, but basically it was directed at the southern states. And what they were saying to the southern states was, now that the Civil War is over, you can't just treat your African American citizens worse than your white citizens. And so this was enshrined into law in the 14th Amendment, and it's called the Equal Protection Clause. States have to treat all of their citizens equally. So about 30 years later, there's a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson. This is in 1896. And you might remember this from American history, or maybe you don't, but Plessy was 1/8 black, and the state of Louisiana had separate train cars for whites and for everybody else. And Plessy was categorized as an everybody else. And so he had to take the other train car, and he filed a suit. And he said, under the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, I'm not being treated equally. I have to ride this train car, and the other, white citizens get to ride the other one. And these types of laws, these segregation laws, were called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws. And the question in that case was, well, can states do this? Can they treat different races differently? And at the time, the Supreme Court said yes, that segregation, treating races differently, did not violate the Equal Protection Clause as long as everybody got a train car. And as long as the train cars were more or less equal, then it didn't, in fact, violate the 14th Amendment. And so that applied not only to train cars, but also to schools and to all sorts of other government services that the states, and mostly the southern states, were discriminating by race in their laws and their facilities and their public services. And the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson basically gave them the go-ahead to do that. And this is in 1896. They said that's not an equal protection clause. You can discriminate by race if you want to. You don't have to, but it's a state-by-state choice. Over time, things start to change. In 1915, the Supreme Court stepped in and said the grandfather clause is unconstitutional. And the grandfather clause, you may have talked about this in American history too, but the grandfather clause said that if your grandfather didn't vote, you couldn't either. And so what that did, it had the effect of basically taking the vote away from African American citizens in the South, from all the states who had it, because their grandfathers were slaves and they couldn't vote. So then the current day African Americans couldn't vote, and then their children and grandchildren couldn't either, because it sort of perpetuates. And the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no, that violates the 15th Amendment. It's basically geared towards African Americans, and you're denying them the right to vote. So that's unconstitutional. In 1919, we added the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, easy to remember, 1919, that said you can't take away somebody's right to vote based on their gender. And so basically what that meant is women now had the right to vote. A few states had given women the right to vote, but it wasn't a nationwide thing. After that amendment in 1919, it was. So women got the right to vote in 1919. And then in 1948, Harry Truman issued an executive order that we're going to integrate the military. Before that, even during World War II, you had separate military units for whites and for African Americans. And Harry Truman said, we're not going to do that. If you're going to serve in the military, you get to serve with everybody else, alongside everybody else, and put an end to that practice. It's around the same time that Jackie Robinson became the first black professional athlete in Major League Baseball. And so things are very slowly starting to change, and this is in the 1940s. And then you get to the 1950s, and you get to Brown v. Board of Education. And we are going to read that in class together. And basically, the challenge was many states still had segregated schools, where the whites went to one school and blacks went to another. And some black students sued and said this violates the Equal Protection Clause. And the schools and the state said, no, it doesn't. And look at Plessy versus Ferguson. You already made this decision. But it came up again, and it went to the Supreme Court in 1954. And we're going to read the details in class. But the Supreme Court said, no more segregation by race. You can't segregate by race in schools. And so sort of by inference, then you couldn't segregate in other services as well, train cars or hospitals or anything like that. So basically, Brown put an end to government segregation, specifically by race. And this was in 1954. And we watched the video in class about Little Rock and how even after this decision, a lot of states still continued to fight it, and it took a long time. But this was a big case for a lot of reasons. We're going to read that in class. So if you want to stop, we're going to stop the video right here, and I'm going to put up a second video on the rest of the slides. And so you can go ahead and move on to that one, or come back and do that one later.